Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
People often ask, how can we end human trafficking? And the answer is really quite easy. If there is no demand, there's no market, there's no buyers, there's no human trafficking. Hello and welcome back. My name is Tiffany and I am your host of True Crime Connections. This week with me is JenniSue Jessen, and we are unraveling the layers of human trafficking and the hope for restoration. Stay tuned for a very powerful episode. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here with me today.
I'm so excited to join you for what I hope is an impactful conversation.
Oh, I think it will be. I can't wait to hear how you unravel the layers of human trafficking. Like, this is very needed, especially in today's day and age.
You know, it is a critically important conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but human trafficking is happening all over the world, and it's happening in every state of the US, in every county of the US, and most cities in the US have documented cases of trafficking. So it is just really critically important that people have their eyes open and are aware of the risks and the realities of what's happening in and around our neighborhoods, our own homes.
Absolutely. Especially warning signs, how you can
Right?
spot. So, I mean, they try very hard to contain that, but hopefully we can now start to put a stop to that. We got to end the bad guys.
Absolutely. That would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, like they say, if there's nobody for sale, nobody can buy. So,
Right. And on the opposite side, if there's no demand, there won't be anybody for sale, right? The traffickers are
exactly.
meeting a demand and profiting off the money that flows from our own pockets, whether it's our demand for cheap labor or cheap sex or cheap products. We all can be complicit in trafficking, and sometimes, a lot of times, unknowingly. So I'm excited to have a conversation and empower your listeners to take an active role in combating it.
Me too. All right, I'm going to give you the floor. I don't know where you would like to begin in your story. So,
Okay, well, I guess I'll give everybody a little bit of a background. And just as a preface, I always like to give a little bit of a content warning. Because this conversation is about trafficking, we're going to be talking about some difficult things. And so for some people, that might be triggery or uncomfortable. And I would just invite those listeners, if you need to pause, step away, you are free to do that, because this will be a challenging conversation, but it's also one with a happy ending. So if you can hang in with us, there is a happy ending coming. My personal experience, I have about 25, 27 years now of experience in the field of trafficking, but the first 14 of that was my personal experience of being trafficked by my grandfather. So I grew up in the Midwest, in southern Missouri, in what many would call the buckle of the Bible Belt. You know, there's a church on every corner. And my grandfather actually was an elder or a deacon in his church. So we went to church on Sundays. But he started selling me to other men for sex when I was 4 years old.
wow.
And by the time I was in kindergarten, I was praying every night that God would just let me die. Please, please, please don't make me wake up again. So that's the baby kindergartner version of suicidal ideation, right? Already at 5 years old, I was pleading with God, don't make me wake up again. And I made all kinds of promises. I'll be good. I'll be quiet. I won't eat much. Just please don't make me wake up. Clearly, he did not answer that prayer. Second grade, I sat on a Sunday morning on a wooden pew, swinging my feet behind the man who had paid to rape me the night before. And the exploitation just grew with the years. As time passed, there were some particularly, well, all of it was violent, but some encounters more violent than others. At the age of 9, I had my neck fractured in 2 places and my pelvis shattered in 3 places when one particularly violent perpetrator, let's see, how can I say this carefully for broadcast? He was unable to rise to the occasion and accomplish what he had paid for. And that made him really, really angry. And so he began to beat me, kick me, stomp me, until strangely enough, my grandfather came in and intervened and pulled me out of that situation. Really curious dynamic we might explore later in our conversation, though, is how trauma bonding happens between an exploited person and the person that is exploiting them. Because in that case, my grandfather had put me in this situation. He had brought me here. He was profiting off of this encounter. And then when my life was literally hanging in the balance, he saved me from it. So there's this strange dynamic of bonding because he protected me, he saved me in the midst of a really traumatic encounter. The exploitation continued. At age 15, he discovered that I was pregnant before I did, but I wasn't allowed to date yet. And so that was super problematic for my grandfather because the risk of being found out was imminent. And so he handled that by taking me to a slaughterhouse on his farm where a man was waiting, and strapped to a wooden table, they aborted that baby. And there's all kinds of long-term consequences to that, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Part of that is, well, I've gone on to be married and have a lovely life, but part of the ramifications of that particular violence when I was 15 is over the years I've been pregnant 17 times and had 14 losses. So 3 live births and a whole party waiting for me in glory someday. 14 babies that I wasn't able to carry to term because of all the damage and scar tissue in my pelvis. So the trauma continued until I was 17. And the day after a failed suicide attempt, I found out I was pregnant again. But this time I found out first. And I often say, I'm not going to get preachy, but this is an important part of my story for me, is I say God sent a son, used sin to send a son that saved my life. Because with that pregnancy, I felt like as desperately as I wanted to die, I didn't want to die with the guilt and shame of having aborted this baby. So I felt like I needed to stay alive at least long enough to give birth. And over the course of my pregnancy, God used that to awaken in me this mama bear instinct. I had an innocent baby to protect. And there had been times throughout my childhood that I had tried to fight back a couple of times, tried to run away a couple of times. And I learned very quickly and very severely that my survival was dependent on my submission and my silence. And I learned those lessons really well, really, really well. And it has taken a lifetime to reclaim my voice. But the beginning of that reclamation began at 17 and pregnant. Now I had this innocent baby to protect. And so, with that, the courage to finally disclose enough information to a counselor for her to intervene and totally blow up my family and make sure that my child and I were safe and protected. So that's how my escape happened, was between the ages of 17 and 18. My child was actually born Christmas break, my freshman year in college. So I had turned 18 by then. But as you might imagine, 14 years of violence, of really unthinkable trauma, requires at least as many years of healing. And I have been in and out of therapy most of my adult life. I'm really grateful for the skills that I've learned to navigate, shame and the pain and the grief and the anger, the rage that comes with having been exploited like that. But recovery is a long, hard fought process. It doesn't happen overnight. And I'm really grateful for all of those steps in the process. Now I've been free for many years, and fast forward to 2011, I've been able to use those experiences, and my husband and I started a nonprofit, an international counter trafficking agency, in June of 2011. So we're 3 months shy of our 13th anniversary, our 13th birthday from when our counter trafficking work began. And we function to fight human trafficking through prevention, restoration, and leadership development. And our prevention program, we've trained national leaders now in 43 countries that are taking this tool we created called Priceless Cube and using it in high risk areas of their country to prevent trafficking. Then we have restoration work, ongoing work in Thailand, Bangladesh, the Middle East, and a new outreach program in Athens, Greece. This last year, we had our first beginning work in Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo as well. So it's been very cool to see how these really tragic experiences have not defined me, but rather equipped me to have incredible impact in the counter trafficking movement. So that's the overview. Now that you know the overview, Miss Tiffany, where do you want to go from there?
First of all, that is amazing what you have been able to accomplish. You should be very, very proud of yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would say, and again, I don't want to be preachy, but if it was up to me, I wouldn't have lived through it. I, was praying to die when I was 5. I tried to complete my suicide at 17 and failed. But I would say God's grace met me there and kept me alive and has brought me to the place that I am. So I appreciate the affirmation. Yes, I've gutted it out. I've crawled forward sometimes on skinned knees, but very little comes from my own strength.
Where were your parents?
That is a great, great question. And I generally leave them out of the storytelling because functionally they were absent. The reality is my dad was an alcoholic and my mom was addicted to my dad. And so the house was often in crisis. And when it was, I truly believe at this point that they were honestly trying to do the best that they knew how to do in the midst of a household in crisis. So when the house was in upheaval, they would send me 3 hours away to my grandparents. And I think initially they were trying to protect me from just the instability of a house that is wrecked by alcoholism and addiction, not knowing or understanding really that I was moving from the frying pan into the fire. You know, my grandfather was far worse than my father's alcoholism.
Right. Did you end up pressing charges or anything?
I didn't press charges. I did. So when I disclosed to my counselor at the age of 17, there were a couple of things about that. And if any of your listeners are survivors of trafficking or sexual assault, sexual abuse, there's these funny things that we do in our mind to navigate survival and healing. One of those things for me was I disclosed to my counselor things that happened up until the age of 9. But there was that particular traumatic event that happened when I was 9. And then my dad quit drinking. And then we moved within 3 miles of my grandparents' house. So the access changed. But for whatever reason, in my mind, everything that happened after the age of 9, I thought was my fault. So I only disclosed to my counselor what had happened up until the age of 9. And in Missouri, where I lived at that time, this was 90, 91, 92. In that time, there was a statute of limitations that you could prosecute childhood sexual abuse, and it was 7 years. So I was beyond the 7 years of what, even though my exploitation had continued, 14, 15, 16, 17, I thought those were my crimes, that it was all my fault. So I did not disclose those. What I did do was I had a civil case against my grandfather. I did pursue that civilly. Unfortunately, my grandfather was really wealthy and really powerful, and corruption or trafficking thrives because of corruption.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because there are people that are in law enforcement that know and are complicit or are participating. It happens because there are judges who are complicit or know and are participating. So my grandfather won the case hands down. After we did our depositions, his lawyers made a motion before the court. They filed what was called a motion in limine. And what they argued to the judge was that if I took the stand and testified, the jury would feel too much emotion to make a rational judgment. So I was not allowed to testify.
That is absolute trash.
Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. There was another piece of the puzzle. I had gone to, back in the day, there was a clinic in Topeka, Kansas called Menninger's. Menninger's Clinic was one of the forefront at that time treating sexual abuse of children. And I had gone through the whole gambit of testing, psychological testing and interviews, forensic interviews. And our expert witness filed his report and deposition that said I was neither exaggerating or minimizing the trauma, that all of my symptoms were in line with what I said happened. Physically, medically, psychologically, it all lined up. But my grandfather wanted me to be interviewed by his expert, which of course is fair and reasonable. Okay. But he wanted me to fly with him, my grandfather, on Christmas Eve and do the forensic interview with his expert in another state on Christmas Day, and then travel back with my grandfather. Of course, my lawyer said, absolutely not. We will submit to your expert, but they need to come here to where we were in Missouri, or we make our own travel arrangements and do it on our own time schedule, right? We're not going Christmas Eve,
Right.
Christmas Day. We're not going with you. We'll book our own travel arrangements and we'll do it that way. And again, the judge ruled that because I refused, which I didn't, but because I refused to submit to their expert, my expert witness was thrown out.
Wow.
The final piece of the puzzle that was really the nail in the coffin of my case was there was an event when I was 3 years old where I was in a car with my grandfather and he was having sexual content with me. I'm trying to be careful with my words in case people are triggered by that, but in that car, we hit and killed a pedestrian. And so in my depositions, I talked about that. And my lawyer went and found the police record of where this guy had been killed in the area that I described, wearing what I had described. So we were going to bring in the detective that worked on this unsolved hit and run, but the primary detective had passed away. So while there was a record, nobody that originally worked on the case was still there. And so the judge ruled that that's hearsay.
That judge needs to be debarred.
Even though I was a witness to the crime, at the time I was only 3 years old. So my witness testimony, when I was testifying, I was 18, 19, but when I witnessed it, I was only 3 years old. And so none of that was allowed. So when we came to court, and they did let me take the stand, but the only thing I could disclose on the stand was being photographed or filmed during my exploitation, which at that time we would have called child pornography. Now we call child sex abuse material. It's really crime scene photos. It's documentation of a crime, right? So they did let me testify about that very briefly, 3 or 4 minutes. But at that time, it wasn't a federally civil actionable offense. So even though I testified to that and his lawyers conceded to that, it wasn't a civil crime at that time. And so what the jury was left with was a very limited testimony. We couldn't bring in my expert witness. We couldn't bring in corroborating evidence. And so my case against my grandfather was dismissed.
That is so unfortunate and just another abuse tactic. I mean, now you're being abused by the court system.
It was absolutely like being bound and gagged and raped again by the court system. It was brutal and horrific. And I lost a lot of faith in our American justice system at that point.
Oh, I can see why. I mean, I honestly feel like that judge should have been debarred. Like,
Right.
this is a child.
Right. So yeah, that is how the legal justice system played out in my case. And in all fairness, had I been well enough to testify about what had happened when I was 14, 15, 16, 17, we would have been within the realm of a prosecution, a criminal case. But I wasn't well enough at the time to know or understand or navigate that. I wasn't well enough, and I didn't understand my own role and responsibility versus my grandfather's. And had I been weller, it might have turned out different. But had I I had been silenced brutally for 14 years and was just finding my voice, and it is
You're
what it
still a
is,
child.
right? In a lot of ways, in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so thankful that they are starting to look at these cases differently in
Yeah.
today's world.
Yeah. The laws have changed, and a lot of states, I'm not sure if Missouri is one of them at this point, but I don't live there anymore. I got out of there as quick as I could. My husband and I say we escaped misery as quick as we could. I'm not sure what the laws on the books are there, but many states now have completely eliminated the statute of limitations for sexual crimes against children. So I'm really, really glad that there has been so much progress in believing survivors and understanding their stories and listening with compassion and supporting them through their recovery that did not really exist in the 90s.
Right. I don't know if it's just it was easier for corruption back then or just there wasn't enough on the topic, but I mean, you should never want to have sex with a child.
Right?
That's
Like that should be a given. That should
you
just
think.
be, we can just start from there, right?
Right? Common freaking sense.
Right. Let's just start from there. If you're going to
Right.
have sex with a child, this is just categorically wrong.
Exactly.
And
I've always said, like, I don't understand how people are attracted to children. Like, I just, nothing about it makes any sense to me. And the fact that men just line up for this kind of stuff,
right,
women rape children too. So, I
they
don't want to
do.
just single that out, but it's weird.
It is weird. And, actually, interesting point of fact, what we found in our work globally, 42% of traffickers are women. Now, they're not the buyers, they're not the perpetrators paying for sex generally, but they're the ones recruiting. They build a trust relationship in communities, in villages, in neighborhoods, and they sell their friends and neighbors and daughters into exploitation. So that's one fact. And I'm not a huge fan in trying to figure out what's going on in the perpetrator's mind. Frankly, I just don't have the energy for it. But one thing that I find interesting is we are all drawn to the beauty and innocence of children. Like you see a baby in the grocery store and you'll like smile at the baby, you'll wave at the baby, you'll coo at the baby, and the baby, especially if they initiate, right? If a little bitty sees you and lights up, we automatically light up in response. And in my opinion, that is a completely normal human social reaction, right? That mirroring that happens. It happens with our mirror neurons, part of our neurobiology. This baby lights up, we light up in response. We delight in the innocence of children. What I think goes catastrophically wrong is that perpetrators have that same impulse that is healthy in the vast majority of the population, but instead of just delighting in it, they want to devour it. And that is, at its core, it's still drawn to the beauty and innocence. Just the life, the play, the desire to, like, the freedom that little people have is something that we all want to see and engage with, but it goes catastrophically wrong when perpetrators, instead of delighting in it, devour it, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
Did your grandmother know what was going on?
that's another great question. Yes, there were points in time that my grandmother did know for sure. There were points in time that my mother should have known. My grandmother, for example, took me shopping for school clothes. It was the end of the summer. I was about to go back home to my parents. She took me shopping for school clothes. She came into the dressing room as I was changing and saw the bruises on my thighs. Pretty significant bruises on my thighs. And when she came into the dressing room, I'll never forget, she kind of like this hard stop and deep breath and just this pause. And then she looked at me in the eyes and said, "We will never, ever discuss this," and turned around and walked out. So, yes, she knew what was happening. You know, the injury that happened when I was 9, when my neck was fractured and pelvis was fractured, that was that one event. And I was in bed at her house for several weeks. You know, she had to bring me food. She had to help me to the bathroom. So she absolutely knew. There were other events that my mom should have known. For example, in kindergarten, for Thanksgiving, we were supposed to draw family pictures for Thanksgiving, what we were thankful of, but it had to be our whole family was supposed to be in the picture. And I drew my mom, my dad, a sibling, and also drew my grandparents. But my grandfather, I drew naked and with an erection. So my kindergarten teacher calls my mom, right? My mom comes and picks me up at school and is furious. I mean, she lost her ever loving mind. So I got in trouble for drawing that picture, but no questions were asked. It was just very clear that you don't draw pictures like that. So
I saw it.
Right.
You know,
like
that was a cry for help.
Yeah, when I was 9 years old and that really violent encounter, actually a different violent encounter happened that put me in a catatonic state for several days. And my mom came and picked me up during that time, and I was completely locked within myself. And so she took me next door neighbor to a pediatrician who was a lovely, great guy. I called him Grandpa Dennis. He was really the only safe man I ever knew growing up. But 9 years old, he sat me on his kitchen table and examined me with all my clothes on, but, you know, figuring out why I was in a catatonic state. And he said, "I don't know what happened, but if she's not better in 7 days, we'll put her in the hospital." Which again should have set off alarm bells in everybody. At 15, when I had the forced abortion in the slaughterhouse, in the following hours was home and was a bloody mess. There was blood everywhere, and I was doubled over in pain. And my mom ended up calling the town doctor. We lived in a little bitty town. You know, a doctor makes house calls there. He came to our house, gave me an IV, sedated me, repaired the damage as much as he could. And then he and my mom collectively decided to put me on birth control. But again, I was 15 and not allowed to date. And so the doctor wrote me a note I didn't have to dress out for PE for the next several weeks. And they put me on the pill, but they didn't tell me they were putting me on the pill. They popped them out of the little circle card and put them in a pill bottle and told me that it would make me have easier periods. So I didn't know until like a year later that it was actually birth control pills that they were giving me. So again, what did my mom know? What should she have known? What could she have known? The doctor that came to repair the damage certainly knew what had happened. But again, no discussion, no questions, no what happened, no who did this, no nothing. I think a lot of times abuse is happening in and around our families, our neighbors, our communities, and it's easier or safer to just not ask.
I was going to say that it's easier to not know for them. They don't
Right,
want to know the truth.
right. Because if I know, then I have to do something.
Right.
And doing something might be costly. And anything unfamiliar is scary, right? Like
Right.
keeping secrets for my mom was familiar. That's where she lived. So to not keep a secret was unfamiliar. That felt more dangerous to her than protecting me.
How long did it take you to realize that you don't have to keep secrets all the time? When you're conditioned like that, you will literally keep everything to yourself. When did you finally say no?
Yeah. Gosh, I don't know that I remember a specific moment. It really was a incremental journey, baby steps. Like I said, I began disclosing to my counselor when I was 17, 18, but just tidbits, which is something that's very common to people who experience any kind of ongoing violence. If it's more than just a one time encounter, survivors tend to disclose, we call it drip disclosure, like just enough to get the help that we need without the full disclosure because we're testing the waters. Are you really safe? Because the people who I thought were safe or were supposed to be safe were the ones exploiting me or protecting my perpetrator, right? My grandfather should have been trustworthy. I loved him. He was my granddad. He would take me for ice cream after the trauma. So I still have a really interesting relationship with the deepest, darkest chocolate ice cream you can get from Baskin Robbins. If everything is going wrong in my world, or if I'm feeling particularly vulnerable, my husband even knows this. If I've been speaking at several events in a row, his default is, do you need some chocolate ice cream? Because what would happen as a child is I would have this violent encounter, and afterwards, as a reward, my grandfather would take me to Baskin Robbins and I would get chocolate ice cream. And the brilliance of our brain, the mystery and intricacy of our brain is that it'll compartmentalize. And so when I stepped into the ice cream place, I was just a little girl with my granddad. And I went from being violated and used to just a little girl with her granddad eating ice cream. And so, in my mind, when I'm feeling what I call a vulnerability hangover, because I've been speaking a lot, sharing my story a lot, um, I crave chocolate ice cream because it symbolizes, it's wired in my body that, okay, everything's okay. We're going to go back to normal. Just a funny little way that our brain and body works. So I quit being a secret keeper. I began that journey when I first disclosed to my counselor. But for years and years, my story, I only shared it in a therapeutic environment. Like other family members didn't know. I shared quite a bit during my lawsuit against my grandfather with lawyers and in depositions, but I didn't talk about it one to one. And then into my marriage, my husband didn't know the depths or details of my exploitation really until 2016. In 2016, May of 2016, I published a book, my own story called The Lucky One. And my husband read my book a week before it went live. And that was the first time he knew many of the details of my exploitation. So it's really only been, I think I really started talking in small groups or one-to-one with other women or individuals who had been exploited or raped, sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, where I felt compelled that my story might encourage them. But it was very small and it was one-to-one between 2013, 14, 15, and then I published my book in 2016. And so since 2016, it's been all out there. No secret keeping
Right.
since then. But that was a long, long time. I got free in 1990. So 26 years before I really started speaking in any real way.
It's a long time to keep something
Yeah.
like that inside.
Yeah. Now, again, just to reiterate, I was in therapy those years between 90 and 2016, where I was regularly dealing with really great licensed therapists, and they were intimately acquainted with my trauma and my story. But outside a therapeutic environment, I didn't share it.
Right. Where do you speak at now? Do you go to like schools? Where mostly what is your speaking arrangements now?
Yeah, I speak at public events raising awareness about human trafficking all over the country. I speak at churches, I speak at youth groups, I speak at women's groups, I speak at Rotary clubs. Really, any group that is interested in understanding the risks and realities about trafficking, I'll go speak. Sometimes it's a secular environment. Sometimes it's a Christian environment. I regularly speak at the local university campus where I live, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. A couple of times a semester, I teach in their nursing school. Students that are on the public health track, I go in and equip them to understand what are the red flags, how do we identify it, and even better, the appropriate and effective ways to intervene in a situation to help facilitate freedom for the patient or client that they're serving. So I speak in all sorts of places, and then I get to have conversations like this on podcasts once or twice a week. So those are the types of spaces that I speak. I also had the opportunity, I served 2 years on the U.S. Advisory Council on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which is a presidential appointment to sit on a council with other survivor leaders and help inform federal counter trafficking policy. So we would regularly meet with the senior policy advisors for the president's cabinet and explore what the US government is doing effectively and is not doing effectively, and how to operate more strategically and effectively. So I had the distinct honor of being appointed at the very end of President Trump's term, appointed by President Trump, but then serving under the Biden administration. Because trafficking isn't political. It crosses every socioeconomic class, gender, uh, culture, people group, race, religion. It goes across all of that. So I straddled both administrations in my 2-year term, advising on counter trafficking policy. But with that term, then that opened up a lot more opportunities for speaking publicly about what trafficking is and is not, and how we might work together, collaborate to disrupt it in effective ways.
Which is so much needed. Like,
Right?
I think the government, they know what's going on. I mean, I'm just going to throw it out there. They know. I'm just not
They
sure how
do.
high it is on their And let's be honest, a lot of politicians are buying some chids themselves.
They are.
So,
Again, trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's corruption and there's complicity that make it thrive. It thrives because there are people at every level of government, of law enforcement, in the medical field that are either participating or are complicit in it. And that's true. I think, in any career you would look at, in law enforcement, there are some really fabulous law enforcement officers, male and female, who are justice driven, who are doing the right thing, who are fighting to create a more just world. And then there's some that are wicked to the core. Uh, Lawyers, there are some that are justice driven, that are fighting for human rights and equality and really great things. And then there's some that are buying kids or complicit in exploitation. Judges, doctors, across any career field you can look at, there are some really noble people and those that are perpetrators. So we can't just categorically say, all politicians are bad. Well, that's probably the iffiest one. Because
agreed.
if you make it high enough to be elected, chances are there have been some compromises to get you in that position.
Right.
Um, but I think there's some people that enter into politics with really noble intentions.
Right.
Uh, but then there's a lot that are all about power. And trafficking at its core, and I want to wrap it up. I know we're to the end of our time, but trafficking at its core is a crime of power, not sex. It's carried out, the means that it's carried out is sex, but the perpetrators are driven by power, not sex. And so any environment that has powerful people and less powerful people, chances are trafficking will happen, because trafficking is always an exploitation of vulnerability.
Right. It's power, it's control, which I mean, I guess is
Yeah.
power, and it's money. It's a
Yeah,
billion-dollar industry.
it is. It is really profitable. And traffickers often have multiple streams of revenue. Like my grandfather, he would profit first from just the cash transaction, the perpetrator paying for access to my body, right? That's one stream of revenue. Second, he would photograph or film the violence, crime scene photos, films, and he would use that to blackmail the perpetrators to continue to pay. And so, if and when the perpetrators refused to pay the blackmail money, then my grandfather would sell those images on the black market as child sex abuse material. So he profited off of my exploitation in at least 3 ways. That's 3 ways that I know about. Of course, I don't have the criminal mastermind that he did, but at least 3 streams of revenue coming from every act of violence that I endured.
It's just so hard to believe that somebody can say they love you and treat you that way, And that's what I think makes it so hard, especially when you are a child.
Right.
Because you love this person, or
Yeah.
you think they love you, but
Yeah.
that's not love.
Yeah. My grandfather, when I did confront him and was taking him to court, one of the first things he said is, now, I never touched you in anything but a loving way. So it wasn't a denial. It was, in his mind, he never touched me in anything but a loving way.
It makes me want to throw up.
Right. Me too. Wicked, wicked bad guy.
Yes. I'm very sorry that, all that has happened to you. But I mean, I think you are doing absolutely amazing things now, and you're trying to change the world for the better.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't just lie there, take it, and then go live your life. You're like, no, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to fight for other women and other children. And that is just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. That is one of the things. Anybody who spends any time with me, and it may be the thorn in my husband's side, is I am not allergic to conflict. So bring it on. Serving on the US Advisory Council, I absolutely week after week would go toe to toe with the senior policymakers at DOJ and Homeland Security. Like, no, not going to yield. Like I
Good
am
for
not
you.
allergic I am not allergic to conflict because, I've survived the worst of the worst. So if somebody gets pissed off, well, okay. Like, what else you got? I am not going to yield on these matters of justice. I'm going to keep on keeping on until I'm on the other side of glory, apparently.
Well,
I
I
don't
think
have
you are there,
quit
my
in
dear.
me.
Yeah.
I don't have quit
No,
in me.
you're a
Mm-mm.
fighter, and that's what's amazing. We need more fighters out there.
We do. We do.
If somebody wants to get a hold of you or donate to the nonprofit, what is the best ways for them to reach you?
Yeah, they can find me. Our organization is called Compass 31, COMPASS 31. So compass31.org. And there's a contact form on there or an email address. They can email me from there. They can donate from there, but they can dive in and find out more about how we work and the role we're playing in the counter trafficking movement, both in the US and globally. So that's how they can find out more. And certainly I'm on social media, Facebook, Instagram. They can find Compass 31 in those places, LinkedIn. Um, but the website would probably be the place to start. And that's where they can contact me directly if they want to have a follow-up conversation.
Perfect. I thank you so much for being here and sharing this story. It is something that needs to be heard. People need to be aware of this. It's happening in your backyard. Open your eyes, see it for what it is, and help be the change.
It is, absolutely. It requires all of us to have our eyes open, to stop scurrying and scrolling, from point A to point B. We have to have our eyes open to see what's happening with the people in our community. And then we have a hope of really disrupting it and maybe even ending it.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Well, I would love to help you in any way that I can. So,
Yeah. Well, this conversation is a great start. Your community will perhaps be empowered to look at the world around them differently, and that's where change happens.
absolutely. Is
Mhm.
there anything else you wanted to add?
No, ma'am. I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you to the listeners. I know it's a difficult conversation. So thank you for entering into my story courageously, and then I hope and pray that you'll be able to take this information and enter into your communities courageously, so that we can create a more just world. So thank you to
Yes.
you and your listeners.
You are so welcome. You are welcome back anytime. I think we all know somebody who can benefit from this episode. Please make sure to share it with them. And thank you guys so much for listening to my podcast. This really means a lot to me. If one of my episodes has helped you in any way, I would really like to know. It's important for me to know that the work that I'm doing is actually helping people. If you want more of me, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me on Instagram and TikTok. If you or anyone you know is in need of national hotlines, please go to truecrimeconnections.com. I have all the phone numbers there listed for anything that you could possibly imagine. All right, my Renowned Roots community, keep building hope and gaining strength. Until next time.